Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and the Harvard Classics lecture number 30. This one again from volume number 4. This is Paradise Regained, book number 2. Now, LearnStrong.net is where I definitely recommend that you go. First of all, down that left-hand side on LearnStrong.net, find where it says Harvard Classics lectures. Scroll down until you find our Milton lectures, especially of Paradise Lost, and then, of course, the lectures I've already given earlier on Paradise Regained. Lecture 28 is an introductory lecture to Paradise Regained, and then lecture 29 is book 1. I will be dealing now in the 30th lecture here with Paradise Regained, book 2. And while, of course, feel free to jump right into my conversation, it will make more sense if you pay attention to earlier lectures first, where, let's review, we talk about our 3 levels of reading and our attempts to connect new information to old information, what we call learning. Those 3 levels of reading. Level 1, a summary reading. What does Paradise Lost or Paradise Regained, book 2 say? Level 2, how do we understand what does this text mean at 2A, themes, messages at 2B, that's our rhetoric. And then finally at level 3, how do I relate to this text? That's our most important level of reading. First at 3A, relating to other titles, other texts, and of course events in the world. And then finally, of course, we'll be looking at how do we relate this to ourselves personally. We're looking at Paradise Regained like we looked at Paradise Lost from 3 perspectives. 1, we want to see it as an epic. 2, we want to see it as a philosophic, theological text. We're going to have much to say about each of these in this lecture. And then 3, we're going to look at Paradise Regained as a political text, first of all from its psychological instantiations and then from its sociological instantiations. We'll look at all of that as we are going through these lectures. But I want to pause for a moment, as I sometimes like to do. And I want to just give a little bit of background information, because if learning is the capacity to connect new information to old information, then I think it makes sense that maybe we ask this question about the Christ story or the Christian story in Christian theology. It is clear that the story I'm about to relate is ever present in Milton's mind as, of course, a Puritan Christian, a practicing Christian, as he is writing this great text, Paradise Regained, which again, I'm going to argue, is a really important text for us to study, even though it's often not given the level of accord and respect that might be given to Paradise Lost. In Matthew 16 and 17, we have what many theologians of the Christian faith will argue is the heart or the center of the story of Christ. Of course, there's 3 parts to the story of Christ, as we've already said, but let's just review. There is Christ's birth, which is, of course, all of those stories from Luke 2 and elsewhere that tell us about those kinds of stories that we're often familiar with, especially in the West, around times of Christmas and December. There is, of course, the 3rd part of the story, which is the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But sitting in the middle, at the very heart of the story about Christ, is a 3-part story that Milton clearly is going to be thinking about, especially as he writes book 2 of Paradise Regained. Well, that story begins in Matthew 16 with a fascinating question. Jesus will come to the people who are closest to him, his disciples. Later they will be called apostles. And he asks them, who do people say that I am? And there's these different answers. You're a prophet, or this, you're that. And then Jesus will turn and ask to his own disciples, who do you say that I am? And it will be that famous utterance of Peter that will become so famous in Christian theology when he says it, that you are the Christ, the Messiah. It's in this moment, in Matthew 16:16, that many have argued Christian theology is born. Christ will in fact respond and say, upon this rock I will build my church, and the fact that Peter's name is associated with the founding of the church makes him the first pontiff in the Catholic faith, etc., etc. But then after this, Christ will predict his own death on a cross. And it will be Peter who will say, no, this cannot happen. And it will then be Christ, in verse 23, who will turn to his best pal, his best friend, his best disciple, Peter, most important disciple, many have said, and he will say, get thee behind me, Satan. Whoa. Now this is a fascinating moment in the story. And it's possible that without maybe this being pointed out, most readers of the gospel text don't actually make these kinds of connections. But let's point out, the "Get thee behind me, Satan" line is a line that actually comes from Matthew 4 and really from Luke 4, although it's alluded to in Matthew 4. But in Luke 4 verse 8, this is exactly what Christ says about the temptations that Satan is giving. The point here being this. Many theologians have pointed out there's a fourth temptation, if you will. And the fourth temptation is here, as Peter is suggesting to Christ, you have enough power that you do not need to die on a cross. You can be the Christ and the Messiah without dying. And it's clear that Christ is wanting to say, I will follow through, even though it's also clear from the Passion narrative, as it's sometimes referred to, that Jesus Christ doesn't want to die. Let this cup pass from me, he will say later in the accounts. Now, why is this important? Because there's a third part to this middle part of the story. And that one happens in Matthew 17, where a few moments later we read that Jesus Christ, taking, again, his favorite, Peter and James and John as well with him, and goes away to a mountain, and this one is usually called the Transfiguration of Jesus Christ, where Christ appears with Moses and Elijah on either side of him as the two great prophets of early antiquity, and of course the Old Testament, as Christians call it, and of course the story of the Jews, especially in regards to those two most influential of prophets, where Christ is in between them, but it is clear that Christ is given preeminence over these two other prophets in the story. Now, early Christians and Christian fathers of Christian theology would reference this story often to point out that Jesus Christ was very special. It is clear that this story is in the mind of Milton as he gets ready to write Paradise Regained. Several times we will have the mention of both Moses and Elijah. We're going to see it again in our comments here in Book 2. And this notion of the fourth temptation, the temptation to use one's power to try to gain some kind of earthly kingdom. Now already we've heard this reference. We're going to see some of the same here in Book 2. Now just to remind, in Book 1 of Paradise Regained, we already have the first temptation as referenced from the Luke and Matthew 4 accounts. Christ has gone off after his baptism, off into the desert, and there in the desert he will be tempted by an old man picking up sticks, who Christ will quickly ascertain is in fact the devil. The same devil who of course came to Eve to offer forbidden fruit. It will be interesting that the first temptation will mirror that temptation in Paradise Lost, right? Book 9 of the Fall. When he will say, that Satan will say to the Son of God, you are hungry, why don't you make rocks into bread? And the response, of course, is that man shall not live by bread alone. The defeat of Satan is, of course, for Milton, the beginnings of understanding how Paradise Lost will now be Paradise Regained. We now will turn in our study to book number 2. And we will open with those opening first 17 lines. And after Satan has left the Son of God and gone away, we now are going to begin the second book. Milton is going to give us some interesting kinds of setup, though. Let's read. Meanwhile, Satan, of course, has been defeated, has gone off. Christ is, of course, still, the Son of God, still in the wilderness. Meanwhile, the new baptized, who yet remained at Jordan with the Baptist and had seen him, whom they heard, so lately called Jesus, Messiah, Son of God, declared, and on that high authority had believed, and with him talked, and with him lodged. I mean, Andrew and Simon. Simon Peter, of course, two of the important disciples. Famous after known with others, though in Holy Writ not named, now missing him. Their joy, so lately found, and so abruptly gone, began to doubt, and doubted many days, and as the days increased their doubt. Sometimes they thought they might only be shown, and for a time caught up to God, as once Moses was in the mountain, missing long, and the great Thisbite, Elijah, who on fiery wheels rode up to heaven. By the way, this is a reference for Moses to Exodus 32 and to Elijah 2 Kings 2:11. Rode up to heaven, yet once again to come. Just to pause, a couple of really important things for your notes right away. You have believers who saw Christ for a brief period of time. This is an interesting question that Milton asked. The Bible, of course, the gospel account doesn't actually give us any of this background information about, while Christ was 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, not eating and being tempted by Satan, Matthew 4, Luke 4. What were his disciples doing? Those who were followers of his, of any number of kinds. Those who had seen, for example, his baptism and had heard the voice of the Father say, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." Well, what were they doing? Well, here, Milton will say it, because I think he's interested in this notion of justifying the ways of God to men. Again, doubt, skepticism, worry, concern. Where is he? Is he coming back? We're going to see more of this kind of skepticism expressed. And then to line 30, for example. We'll skip now. Alas, from what high hope to what repast unlooked for are we fallen? And again, we're back to this notion of lost or fallen, right? In other words, our hopes are all gone. Our eyes beheld Messiah, certainly. How come so long expected of our fathers? We have heard his words, his wisdom, full of grace and truth. Now for sure deliverance is at hand. The kingdom shall to Israel be restored. Thus we rejoiced, but soon our joy is turned into perplexity. Joy to doubt, skepticism, perplexity, worry. And new amaze. Of course, we know how amaze is such an important word from Paradise Lost. For whither is he gone? What accident hath rapt him from us? Will he now retire after appearance and again prolong our expectation? God of Israel, send thy Messiah forth. The time is come. Behold the kings of the earth, how they oppress thy chosen. That is to say, I hope he's coming back. He says it. Arise and vindicate thy glory. Free thy people from their yoke. But let us wait. Thus far he hath performed, sent his anointed, and to us revealed him by his great prophet, pointed at and shown in public. And with him we have conversed. At line 58, new hope resumed. Thus they out of their plights, new hope resumed, to find whom at first they found unsought. But to his mother Mary, when she saw others return from baptism, not her son, nor left at Jordan tidings of him none, within her breast, though calm, her breast, though pure, motherly cares and fears got head, and raised some troubled thoughts, which she in sighs thus clad. And at line 66, we have Mother Mary's soliloquy. Oh, what avails me now that honor high to have conceived of God, or that salute, hail, highly favored among women blessed. Mary will begin in her soliloquy. We marry, no pun intended, we measure or marry this one with the soliloquy of Christ in Book 1 of the Son of God in Book 1. Here, in her mind, she is also perplexed. What is going on? At line 76, for example, the flight to Egypt, referencing, of course, Matthew 2:16. At line 78, she makes the observation that it could have easily been the case that her son could have been killed, because, of course, Herod will kill all of those children in Bethlehem, infant blood. And we immediately go back, of course, to Paradise Lost, to the stories in Paradise Lost that we've already talked about in earlier lectures. Of course, as we said in earlier lectures in Paradise Lost, it is wrong, of course, for others to kill infants, and yet the Passover story is a Passover of firstborns being killed, right? And we think as well of Psalm 137 and that killing of infants as a way of vengeance. There's obviously theological complications in some of these questions. We simply raise them. I'll let you decide how you want to think about them. At line 95, at line 81, she says it about her son, Christ, Jesus, that his life was private, unactive, calm, contemplative, little suspicious to any king, But now, full grown to man, acknowledged as I hear by John the Baptist and in public shown, Son, owned from heaven by his Father's voice. I looked for some great change. So Mother Mary is wondering about her son. Notice in our text, everyone is wondering about this Jesus, this Son of God as named, right? Line 95. But where delays he now? Some great intent conceals him, right? She reminds herself, when 12 years he scarce had seen, I lost him, but so found as well I saw him. Of course, this is that story about how Christ, when he was a child, in Luke 2:49, right, asked that question, don't you know that I need to be about my Father's business? At line 101, and again at line 112, we have some great purpose or some great work that maybe is about to happen. And then finally, we will have the beginnings of our book, really the heart of book 2, the temptations. And it begins again with Satan. Notice how Milton has this template. He likes to start with Satan and then move in his story, just like he did in Paradise Lost, just like he did in book 1. Satan comes at line 121, and he will have a very interesting statement to all of the demons back in hell. Let's read it. Princes, heaven's ancient sons, ethereal thrones, daemons, spirits, now, from the element each of his reign allotted, rightly called powers of fire, air, water, earth beneath. So may we hold our place in these mild seats without new trouble. Such an enemy is risen to invade us. Note Milton and the way he'll play games with his Christian theology. Is risen, of course, the idea that Christ will ultimately regain Eden through the resurrection and all of that, right? Is risen to invade us, who no less threatens than our expulsion down to hell. I, as I undertook and with the vote consenting in full frequence was empowered, have found him, viewed him, tasted him. We think of Psalm 34:8, don't we? But find far other labor to be undergone than when I dealt with Adam, first of men, though Adam by his wife's allurement fell. However, to this man inferior far. In other words, I was able to convince Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit because she could convince her man. By the way, we're going to have this notion about women being a temptation here in a little bit from Bilal. But notice he says, this one I'm dealing with now, this Son of God, this Jesus, yeah, he's way beyond anything that Adam was. If he be man, my mother's side at least with more than human gifts from heaven adorned, perfection's absolute, grace is divine, and amplitude of mind to greatest deeds. Therefore I am returned less confidence of my success with Eve in paradise. Deceive ye to persuasion oversure of like succeeding here. In other words, I don't think this project's going to be as easy as I thought it was going to be. I summon all rather to be in readiness, with hand or counsel to assist, lest I, who erst thought none my equal, now be overmatched. Christ, if you will, is a tough enemy. That is to say, I'm not sure this is going to be such an easy get for me in regards to tempting the Son of God. Line 150, we have Belal's suggestion, and it's almost a humorous one. Belal says, hey, listen, it's very simple. Why don't you just put women in front of his eyes, right? And at line 170, for example, it's simple, referencing Solomon. He says it, women, when nothing else, beguiled the heart of wisest Solomon and made him build and made him bow to the gods of his wives. Of course, it's an ancient tradition that Solomon was the wisest man until, of course, he started marrying lots of wives. There's different, arguments as to the authenticity of his hundreds and hundreds of wives that Solomon had. Right? Satan's response at 172 is a funny one. It's an interesting one. It's an ironic one. Yeah, that won't work. He mentions Alexander the Great at line 196 as a man who was not given to temptations of sleeping with lots of women. And then at line 205 he says, Christ, let's read it at line 205, he, Christ, whom we attempt is wiser far than Solomon, we think of Matthew 12:42 here, of most exalted mind, made and set wholly on the accomplishment of greatest things. In other words, I don't think that this is going to work out so well for us. To continue at line 220 to 234, it's such powerful stuff. He speaks to Bilal and he says, listen, I'm not sure putting beautiful women in front of this guy is going to work. Watch this. For beauty stands in the admiration only of weak minds. led captive, cease to admire, and all her plumes fall flat and shrink into a trivial toy of sudden sighting quite abashed. Therefore, with manlier objects we must try his constancy, with such as have more show of worth, of honor, glory, and popular praise, rocks whereon greatest men have oftenest wrecked. Now, of course, the irony of using the word rock, because in the first temptation, you'll remember, turn the rock into bread and all of that, right? In other words, he says it. Lots of men have been jacked on something other than a beautiful woman. Like, for example, pride or the quest for glory. We are aware that the challenges are coming here, right? And then to finish this one up through line 234. Or that which only seems to satisfy lawful desires of nature not beyond. And now I know he hungers. This is an important line for us, right? Hungering in Book 2 is going to be shown to be of two kinds. Physical hungering, makes sense if you go for 40 days and nights without eating. And then spiritual hunger, which may be even more profound than physical hunger. And now I know he hungers, where no food is to be found in the wild wilderness. The rest commit to me. I shall let pass no advantage in his strength as oft assay. So in other words, I'm going to test his strength again. And this time I'm going to use his hunger against him. At line 235, Satan will take a happy, a chosen band of demon spirits with him, and off he goes, right? Now, we're finally ready to meet Christ in Book 2, and we're going to get another soliloquy of Christ. And here we are at line 245 to 259. We'll read this one. It's a beautiful, again, soliloquy, and it begins with an interesting question. Where will this end? It's an interesting question on a number of counts. Christ, for Milton, the Son of God, is a character who is trying to come to terms with the work that he knows he's been sent to do.